On my desk, in a little leather binder, I keep a full campaign journal, retellings of the adventures of my party, both to chronicle said adventures for the future and as a form of cool note-taking. As I was looking back at this journal, I remembered something. Session 7, A Gambler's Deal, which was probably the worst session of D&D, at least during my current home game. It got me thinking, how can I learn, and how have I learned, from my worst D&D sessions? So today, we're going to be going over 2 of my worst sessions, the one I previously brought up, as well as a session from a Curse of Strahd campaign I ran a while back, to learn from my mistakes and to improve your games in the future. Okay, let's start with that Gambler's Deal session. By the way, I do give each one a cool name in my notes because, why not? It's cool. But anyway, why was this session rough? Well, it came down to a few things, and I want to make it clear that this isn't some kind of RPG horror story. I cover plenty of those, and this doesn't even come close to that caliber. This is just a session that didn't go as well as I wanted it to, and I had a really cool idea for it. I based the idea for the dungeon off of Destiny's Gambit game mode, where a character known as the Drifter flips a coin and sends you to kill a randomly chosen enemy of humanity, one of the 5 alien races in that game. I wanted to emulate that. This character, the gambler instead of the Drifter, would roll a dice, because it's D&D, and pick one of 6 different bosses for the players to take down, because I didn't want to recreate the waves of enemies thing in Dungeons & Dragons. I didn't think it would work as well. I designed each boss fight to be unique and interesting, since it would be basically just a one-off, just the boss with maybe a few enemies before it. The boss had to be memorable. This sounds good on paper, however, there's a major problem. There's a number of bosses that aren't going to be used. Only one of them is selected, the others get ditched. Now, of course, I ended up reusing these boss fights for later elements of my game, so they weren't wasted, but it was a lot of prep time that I could have used to do something else, like make the other parts of the session more interesting. I focused a lot on the mechanics of each boss fight and the backstory of the gambler. I put a lot of effort into making this gambler character more than just a riff off of the character from Destiny, and I think I did a good job. He ended up being unique and memorable, and I've brought him back multiple times in the campaign. However, this is a long-term payoff to the preparation I put into his character. I could have just done this at another time. In the short term, the gambler just ended up being some quirky pirate-looking guy that teleported the competitors away to go fight a boss, and he talked in a cool accent. That was it. The players didn't know anything about his backstory. Most of the interesting parts of his character weren't explored yet. He was just really a interesting-ish NPC. These are 2 pretty good examples of wasted prep, or at least prep that didn't pay off in the session. Because I focused so much on these sort of superfluous elements, I didn't have time to really nail down a structure for the session itself. The gambler's game was introduced very poorly. The party were contracted by a random NPC that they didn't know and who actually never made an appearance again. They actually never found out what happened to him. They were brought into a location that I'm still pretty proud of, a flooded district with a ship acting as the central building, a pirate ship that's been flipped over and is now used as a location for this interesting sport run by this purple tiefling, the gambler. The place was fleshed out, but the people in it weren't. There were no other memorable NPCs, and the NPC that brought them into this location just kind of disappeared to the wayside. Then there was a really random pit fight just because I wanted to fill time, which is never a good idea. Combat should have a purpose beyond just filling time, and the combat itself was super boring. The pit fighters were not interesting. I didn't give them interesting mechanics or anything. They were just basically punching bags that hit back, but only kind of. They were barely a threat. I think the players had fun beating the crap out of these pointless NPCs, but it wasn't as much fun as I think it could have been. The boss fight did save the session. It was really fun and the players enjoyed it. It had a cool mechanic where the beholder would essentially do a disintegration ray across the entire room and the players could use statues in the room itself to protect themselves. It actually caused some really creative spell use to get the players from statue to statue really fast while also doing damage to the beholder. It was a great fight. However, the majority of the session was rough. It was barely structured. The players didn't have an interesting hook into the main conflict and the story. It felt like a really messily written one-shot, and on top of all that, it was completely separated from the plot of the main campaign. It had nothing to do with what they were doing at the time. I managed to salvage this and turn it into something really cool. The gambler and his deity actually ended up becoming main elements of the campaign. One of my players multi-classed into Warlock and took this orphan character as his patron. It was really great, and that I'm really proud of. I managed to salvage it and turn it into something good, and I think that that's a major lesson we can learn here. Even if a session is rough, it can be salvaged. Even if the story doesn't make sense, look through it. Check if there's a thread that you can grab hold of to create an interesting plot. This session that I had was a mess, but it resulted in a really cool plot line for my campaign that was not only interesting, but also tied into the main story. I'll go over it one more time, but the thing that made this session go wrong was Superfluous Prep. I was prepping in the wrong places, boss fights that I wouldn't use for a while, a character whose backstory wouldn't really be explored in this session, etc. I should have focused into giving the session a good structure, a good hook, and making sure that it was connected to the plot so that it didn't feel like just a pointless errand for the players. Okay, so what went wrong with the Curse of Strahd game? Well, for starters, I had another boring combat, and this time there was no boss fight to save it. I felt, for some reason, very cooped into using specific enemies in Curse of Strahd. I wanted to just use undead because Strahd is a vampire and that's what he would employ, and it made the campaign very boring, or at least the combat very boring. There was just a lot of zombies and skeletons and maybe some ghouls and ghasts thrown in there. These enemies are not very interesting, at least to me, especially when you use them so often. The party will mow through them over and over and over again, and it just gets repetitive. This was yet another time where I just used a bunch of small enemies without much mechanics to it, and it was a really boring, easy, but tedious combat that took forever. It was bad, I'm not gonna lie. Hordes can work, but I didn't have the skill set to make it work at the time, and it just ended up being tedious. On top of that, during the session, I messed up a major character introduction. There was an NPC named Lord Blackwater that I wanted to become a recurring character. He was an original creation of mine, and that's another mistake. Tampering with a module when you're not ready to do so. At this point, I was a relatively new DM. I was not ready to tamper with a module like this, adding a new character. However, I was really proud of the writing I had done for him, and I still think it was at least alright. But I completely botched the introduction. Instead of coming off as the very in-control, lawful lord who can manipulate the city from the shadows while using his domineering personality to own the room, this lord just came off like a stubborn snob. His dialogue wasn't pre-written, I didn't write anything in advance, there was nothing prepared for this lord, and that was the big crime. It's funny because Lord Blackwater was based on Tywin Lannister from Game of Thrones, who has one of the most simple yet effective introductions of any show. In Game of Thrones, Tywin is talked about throughout Season 1, but he makes his appearance just at the tail end. He's supposed to be this incredibly intimidating man. People talk about him in fearful tones. He's one of the most powerful men in the realm, if not the most powerful man in the realm. However, when he's first seen, he's seen just butchering a stag. A very mundane task, not befitting of a lord, but it immediately makes him stand out. And throughout his dialogue, he shows that he is in complete control of the very stressful situation he was put in.
I didn't realize you placed such a high value on my brother's life.
He's a Lannister. He might be the lowest of the Lannisters, but he's one of us. And every day that he remains a prisoner, the less our name commands respect.
So the Lion does concern himself with the opinions
No, that's not an opinion, it's a fact. If another house can seize one of our own and hold him captive with impunity, we are no longer a house to be feared.
This is a character introduction, and even though I based this character off of Tywin Lannister, I didn't realize that it's not just the character, but the situation that makes a character introduction effective. You need to prepare at least a little bit. Think about how to make this character memorable off the bat. First impressions are everything. If a character just comes off as some snobby lord, that's who the players are going to think he is. I like to think I've learned, and I've gotten better at this. A character that I am very proud of and who I've talked about in the past, Crawford Cyrillish, a Machiavellian manipulator. I've finally introduced him to the party properly. He's been foreshadowed for a while, and now his identity has finally been revealed in a pretty major twist that absolutely shocked the players. I don't have time to go into all the details, but let's just say that he was manipulating the party for 10 sessions and they had no idea. It was really brilliant and made him immediately stand out. It showed the players that he was a manipulator who could make them do what he wants even if they have no idea. It was an effective introduction and communicated what he was all about. So, what went wrong with this session in summary? Well, boring combat. Make sure to have a variety of creatures, and if you don't, make sure to make the combat interesting. Interesting and difficult combat is always better than tedious, boring combat. Also, when it comes to introductions, first impressions are everything when it comes to NPCs. Make sure to nail that first impression, and if you don't, do what I did with the Gambler and do some writing to recover from that. Okay, that is going to wrap it up for today. If you guys enjoyed this episode of Tabletop Tavern Tips, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more episodes of this series by me, then please do hit subscribe. Statistically, 85% of you watching this are not subscribed, so you know what to do. The power is in your hands. Subscribe to Crispy's Tavern. Do it. And finally, if you want to leave your own thoughts, go to the comments down below. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.